solve problems until we've had a conversation about what we as a society think the issues are. And I do think that the COVID crisis partly has accelerated trends that we were already seeing and perhaps weren't discussed as much as they could have been, about the increased use of tech at work, about whether people really understand the ways in which AI is being used, about the way that work is not necessarily the same as having a job or having a workplace, and also about the great divisions which I think have arisen in our economy and our society. And the Institute of the Future of Work has just commissioned an opinion poll on this, and it shows very clearly that there are real distinctions between levels of optimism about work, depending on how far people have skills, how far they have access to tech, how far they have control over their workplace. And I do think that we will see a rise in inequality and discrimination as a result of the coming together of the COVID crisis and the rapid adoption of some tech solutions without necessarily having had the opportunity to think about that. Because that's the second point, that there have been some real sudden shifts, I think, in the conversations we've had and the trends in society as a result of the COVID crisis. So, for example, the clapping for carers, the clap for carers shows that really clearly that what we as a society reward financially is not the same as what we need most, or actually what we value most when push comes to shove. The adoption of the furloughing scheme effectively, for a short time, nationalising work, a large part of work to avoid sudden mass redundancy, has shown us that society as a whole is too big to fail. We can't just say that's it. There's a massive loss of need for certain people in certain places, and they'll just lose their jobs, and we'll have subsistence level welfare benefits for them. And also a big discussion about, and in a way an unsought but nonetheless massive social experiment in what happens when we suddenly stop working as we do, the interactions between our patterns of work and consumption and the climate crisis. And finally, really well-founded anxieties about what is going to happen in the future, what is going to be the future of people's work and jobs. And that is, as this opinion poll said, but it's scarcely surprising, really unequally distributed, because the more insecure your work, the less power you have over it, the more likely you are to be worried about it. And then finally, I think, perhaps what's been shown up as a result of discussion about the lockdown rules and how they're applied is that people really care about equal dignity and respect, and the concept of being in it together. That isn't something that's gone away. And there were discussions that actually people had become much more individualistic, and I'm not sure that is true. I think maybe people felt they needed to be more individualistic than they had been. So I think what we've seen is people experimenting in small and large ways about what can we do to respond to new problems. Community hubs, for example, a lot of people who've been furloughed, who can't work for one reason or another, saying, what can I do as a volunteer? What can I do to leverage businesses that can't do what they're doing at the moment and can maybe work in different ways, working with local government, for example, hotels, which otherwise wouldn't have clients, working with local authorities to house homeless people so they're not on the streets during the COVID crisis, things like that, working together to solve problems. So inevitably now, as we start to come out of the first phase of the crisis and move into the beginning of the end of the furlough scheme, seeing how we can ease up the restrictions and move back to some form of new normal, there are going to be huge disruptions. There are going to be huge shifts, and certainly in the short term, I think there's going to be mass unemployment because the economy is going to be changed so quickly and so fundamentally. And I think it's very important that we as a society think about how we want that to happen. Do we want to have a soup kitchen model where we say that there is an enormous and uncontrollable social shift and a large number of people will be on benefits for a long time and we'll have to worry about how we pay for those benefits but that will be inevitable. Or what I hope will happen, which is an investment model, which does have a standing commission on the future of work, and in which we have these big conversations between central government and local government and industry and workers' organisations working together to talk about the kind of society we want to build, given that the shift has happened so much faster than anyone expected it to. For myself, I would like to see a guarantee of living wage work, a kind of Green New Deal, certainly for people starting to enter the workplace, but perhaps more widely. We will be paying, inevitably, we as a society through our taxes or borrowing will be paying for the future of work in one way or another. And I would like to see a discussion and invest in the ways that the state can encourage investment in good work, in maybe investment in key work or in new sectors. And finally, Darren talked about the great potential benefits of the use of AI at work, and that's certainly true. And in any event, I think greater use of AI at work is inevitable. But I'm a lawyer too. To a lawyer, everything looks like what laws can we have? How can we enforce this? And I do think that in relation to the use of AI, we really do need to discuss what is and is not properly regulated at the moment. I'm not sure that the risk of AI supercharging some of the inequalities in our society because of the correlations that the tech draws, which we can't explain, and which may be based on historical levels of historical patterns of work that may in themselves contain social inequalities. I'm not sure that that's very susceptible to individual enforcement through employment tribunals and equality law claims. And I do think we ought to start looking at who is responsible, who is accountable for the use of AI at work, and can we have some sort of audit model so that we ensure that we're getting the best out of AI and not the worst. And finally, I thought it was very interesting what Darren was saying about who defines what is best practice. And that's why I think it's incredibly important that we do have this collaborative model and get people together to have some really important conversations about how we ensure things I think we do value in this country. We do value equal application of the law and actually some level of fairness and inequality of outcome. I think we value autonomy and people's sense of control about their place at work. And we value accountability, that people who have power use it fairly and can be held to account for the way it's used. And these are all things that I think we can bring together in this sort of conversation. And it's incredibly important that we do that.
Thank you, Helen. And I want to ask you something quite specific, actually, because both you and Darren have mentioned the kind of perils of rushing in technology a bit too quickly without the checks and balances. And you've talked a lot about the importance of good work rather than just work. And one of the things that I've noticed cropping up more than ever during the pandemic is the issue of workplace surveillance, where there seems to be a rush of surveillance coming in either off the back of kind of health monitoring or because of helping remote workers to track their productivity. So, you know, notionally for well-intentioned reasons. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on kind of how that, you know, may or may not be a good idea.
Yes, I mean, I think it's going to be very important to have trust in, if we're going to use apps, for example, to help with track and trace. If you're going to get enough buy-in for that, people have to trust it. And people are not going to trust it if they're concerned about potential backdoor ways of using the tech. So we need clear and comprehensible legal frameworks around that, particularly if it's going to be a centralised NHS app. And I was struck by something I heard, that when the Grenfell disaster happened, it was often very difficult to find who was there. And the reason it was hard to find who was there was that people were frightened to give information to the state for purposes where they needed it, for health or education or other things, because they were worried that it might be used for immigration enforcement or for policing. So if people don't trust the state, they're not going to adopt the tech that they need to adopt to keep us all safe. And I think it's important that we do have safeguards around that, and people are clear about their power in relation to their own data.
Thank you very much. So let's move to our final panelist, Peter Cheese. Now, Peter is the Chief Executive of the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, CIPD, and he's co-chair of the government's Task Force on Flexible Working. CIPD is the professional body for people working in HR, and I was chatting to Peter earlier, and it's clear that he looks at issues around leadership, organisation, people and cultural dynamics, and he's also had a lot of exposure to technology as well as other factors. So I'm anticipating a broad perspective from you, Peter. Please take it away.
Thank you, Naomi, and good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be part of.
No, I can hear him.
No, you're good.
Am I still on mute? Yeah, so.
No,
yeah, good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here on this stage and part of this conversation. As Naomi said, I'm going to look at this from a sort of broader perspective, and particularly from the sort of people cultural dynamic. I mean, the fact is that we've been debating the future of work, in my experience, more in the last 10 years than we ever have before. And it's because there are many big changes that are affecting the world of work. And you can think about it, and I often do, from a pestle model, so political change, which is huge, a lot of change in geopolitics, even, and if you saw it a couple of weeks ago, the headline in The Economist was, "Is this the end of globalization?" So really, really big, profound things happening in the political arena. Economic shifts, which have been going on for quite some time, and not just because of the current recession, but because of other shifts in the economy, big shifts away from tangibles to intangibles, much more of a knowledge and services-based economy, which has big impacts on jobs and skills and other things. And of course, post-COVID, I mean, we've talked already quite a lot about the crisis. What will happen post-COVID in potentially restructuring of industry sectors where some may see a long-term decline and others seeing more rapid growth. So a lot of economic shifts. Social shifts. We've debated again the incoming generations, Gen Y as it was, the millennials, now Gen Z, but increasingly called the Zoomers in this current context, and their expectations of work and how they think about what they expect from their leaders and their managers, much more feedback, much more interaction, and much more voice, things of that nature. Clearly, technology, enormous, and that's a big part of course, the whole theme of CogX. But Naomi, you mentioned the fourth industrial revolution. I'm always very, very minded of what Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum said about it. He said it was about putting people first. He said that technology are fundamentally tools made by people for people. And I think that is very much a driving force of the idea of the fourth industrial revolution. Obviously, a lot of legal change, and we've already heard a little bit from Darren and Helen, regulatory shifts, more expectations on businesses and being more transparent about how they behave and what they do, what they report on, things of that nature, ESG and so on. And let's not forget E, environmental. I mean, the fact is that the Extinction Rebellion called out many challenges that have been growing for a long time, and therefore the greening of the economy is a very, very vital part of what every business and organization should see front and center part of its purpose. All of this has meant that there's been a lot of change in the jobs we do, the ways we work, the nature of organizations, and even the workplaces, which of course is now being debated hugely in a post-COVID world. And new models emerging, much more networked organizations, holocracies, which are much less rule-bound, much more democracies, ways of working. The growth of gig work and the so-called gig economy, which I can already see a question about. So people can access work in very, very different forms and ways. So you've got all of these things, and obviously emergence therefore of whole new models and organizations. I mean, it's often said that companies like Airbnb, as the biggest hospitality company in the world, owns no hotels, and Uber, the biggest taxi driving firm, if you will, owns no taxis. So very different organizational models already growing. And we've also seen a shift from large corporation growth much more to smaller enterprises. So a significant shift, and already we know in this country, which is common with most, 2/3 of people work in small enterprise, so 250 people or less, and that creates a very different dynamic. And indeed, young people often saying they would prefer to work in a small business because they feel they have more voice, more control, it's more entrepreneurial, and they get wider boundaries in which they can play. We've seen the growth of the contract and contingent workforce, not just because of things like the gig economy, but because access to skills has become harder. And for many organizations, they're saying if I need tech skills, then probably I'm going to have to get them through these more contingent workforces because people are choosing to work in those ways. You know, a contract worker, particularly in a high demand sector like tech, can often get paid more and have all of the flexibility which people are demanding so much more from work. We're also seeing much higher levels of expectation of trust and transparency of businesses, and trust, I think, is a really elemental point now. Because if you're familiar with Edelman's trust barometer, it's an index of trust, if you will. It's been running for many years. It has steadily been pointing to the decline in trust in the establishment. Now, the establishment is all of us. It's business, it's big business, it's politicians, it's institutions, and so on. And the really sad fact of these recent weeks of the call out on racism and so many people pointing to institutions and saying, we are not sure we trust you. We are not sure you're representing all of our interests. And those become really important parts of the future work. Obviously, you know, linking to the idea that young people in particular, you know, want different experiences of work, there's more expectation of mobility. We've used this expression in the past of a job for life, which has very rapidly become a life of jobs. And people talk about maybe having 15 to 20 different jobs during their careers, which incidentally for the younger generation will last longer. They're much more likely to be working into their 70s. They're going to live longer. And those sorts of things have an impact as well. And looking at things like career breaks is becoming much more part of a norm. And finally, inclusion. Now, I've already touched on one aspect of it. And yes, there's been some positive indicators. There's been significant growth, for example, of women participating in work, and particularly with more support for flexible working. But oh my goodness, we have a long way to go on those issues as well, as has already been pointed out by both Helen and Darren. So when you look at those sorts of things, you also realize that the reality is that a lot of things have needed to change in work. And in many ways, I believe that that this pandemic can be a catalyst, because so many of these trends and many of the things that I've already talked about were pre-existing. They're not being created because of the pandemic, but the pandemic is shining a real light on them. And so things like, what do we do about productivity? Been a long debate about that. Is technology really helping productivity or not? And how do you even measure productivity in an economy which is increasingly based on intangibles and service and knowledge? And is that the right thing to be driving for? Because what we also have is growing inequality at work. As has already been talked about, this growing inequality of wages and what is fair about whether I'm a so-called essential worker now who may be on a low-paid job, versus others who are earning disproportionate amounts of money and perhaps contributing less to the value of society and economies at large. Those sorts of things need to be addressed. Inclusion in its widest sense absolutely must be addressed, and every form of it, all the protected characteristics, so gender equality, racial equality, and the whole ways in which we really do address racism, as I said, in our institutions and organizations. Diversity of thinking, diversity of background, age, and all these things. Now, why is that important? It's important societally, but it's also important for good business, because good business thrives off diversity of background and experience, and it thrives off the idea that I represent as an organization the societies and communities which I'm part of and the customers which I serve. And if you really look at technology, a lot of it has actually not all worked to the benefit of people. It has not always been inclusive. It has sometimes disempowered people and created jobs which have less meaning because we're being controlled more by machines or robots or artificial intelligence. And indeed, what is a big worry now is the squeezing out of middle-skilled jobs because of the advances of artificial intelligence and its ability to do very cognitive tasks and analytical tasks extremely well. And yet we're still also caught in old paradigms of work, aren't we? I mean, the idea of standard hours and working Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, all commuting and all doing these things. And I'm often struck by John Maynard Keynes, who said back in the 1930s that he expected by now we'd be working 15-hour weeks, where many of us are still working 15-hour days, and yet at the other end of the spectrum, people who may be only working part-time because that's the only opportunity they have. So the disparity of the spread of work. And then finally, let's not forget mental health. Mental health has become one of the modern world's real problems. And there is a pandemic in mental health. And indeed, our own work on this, and we've just recently announced our research on the Good Work Index, as we call it, has pointed to the fact that almost 40% or just over 40% of people feel that work is not helping their mental health. It's detrimental to their mental health. And the pandemic is making things worse. So to try to summarize those things and say, so what should we drive this from? What are the principles? Now, at one level, of course, we can talk about regulation and law, but the real heart of this, to my view, is principles and what we believe in as organizations. And we should drive it from principles of that work should be good for us, that well-being should be an outcome which businesses are responsible for. Because if we drive outcome in our people and our organizations, that in turn will create loyalty, retention, productivity, will reduce absenteeism from work, but would also reduce other things like presenteeism from work. So we need to think about it in those terms, and we also need to think about trust as being an outcome of good work. Because again, to go back to Edelman, it was really interesting in their most recent survey that they said the number one thing that will drive trust in organizations is how well they treat their people. And in this current pandemic, how we respond to the pandemic is clearly calling that out. So then you get to this construct of good work, and we've touched on it already, and it should be, and it is being seen as a very central idea. It's baked into the industrial strategy in this country. It's being talked about in many of the regions and nations right across the United Kingdom. The idea that we should be able to create good work. Now, what is good work? Well, it's something I rewarded and paid for fairly, that I have job conditions which I understand and treat me well, that the job design and the nature of my work gives me purpose, it's using my skills effectively, and it gives me social support, and it gives me work-life balance, and it creates the idea of an outcome of good well-being. So finally then is this whole idea of skills, and Darren touched on it as well, because we've got to mix the idea of all these things of good work and having jobs that use people's skills to say, well, but what are those skills in the future? And people now talk about job skills having a half-life of 5 years or less, because technology is impacting work that much. The Institute for the Future of Work just recently, in their most recent survey, said that something like 40% of people in the last year had seen their job being impacted by technology, and a further 40% expected to see it being impacted again in the coming years. So what are those skills? Well, underlying all jobs, interestingly, are essential skills which are very largely human. They are the skills of empathy, of collaboration, of teamwork, of critical thinking. And all those things increasingly being talked about employers now who are saying, I need to recruit on attitude, which are those sorts of essential skills. And I will have to build the job skills that I need. So how do we do that? How do we empower learning and development in very different ways? And how do we deal with things like lifelong learning and recognize that not everybody in the workforce will have the opportunity to learn skills through an organization? So if they're moving around, if they're contingent workers, gig workers, how do we create systems that support them as well? So this is an incredible time of opportunity. I mean, it's that old Churchillian saying, don't let a good crisis to go to waste. And as I've stressed, I think so many of the issues of the modern world of work were already with us. Technology being a big driver of change without a doubt, but many other things besides, as I highlighted. And now is our opportunity to bring those things together. But the reality also, and another great quote, is that the best way to predict the future is to help to create it. And I profoundly believe that's what we need to do now. We need to help to create a better future, which is more equal, more inclusive, which is fairer, which provides more good work and opportunities for everybody. And that idea that we can best predict the future by helping to create it was originally a quote from Abraham Lincoln, and has been many times requoted by people like Peter Drucker. So let's use that as a message also to go forward from. So thank you, Naomi, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And picking up on the poll that we did recently jointly with Opinion, one of the things that came out of that was that people do more readily accept change when they're involved in decision making. And in the poll, 61% of workers said that consulting workers before introducing new technology makes it more effective, but that only 36% had been consulted. Does that surprise you?
Well, it surprises and disappoints, I suppose, in equal measure, isn't it? Yeah, we need to involve our people in this debate about the future of work, about how their job's changing. Because I do believe, in all honesty, that an awful lot of technology has been done. It's been implemented in organizations without consultation, sometimes without even thinking really about the human dimension. It's been too much thinking about, well, this is what the technology could do, and what's left over, well, maybe that'll create a job for somebody. And a lot of robotics implementations or work scheduling algorithms have seemingly done that, which is why I made the point that, and of course it's not true everywhere, but there have been too many examples where technology has not created a better outcome for people, better jobs, good work. So it does surprise, it disappoints and surprises me in equal measure. And we need to use input like that to say, yes, we must consult with our people about the future work, the future jobs, how they're changing, what they would want from work. Because if we don't do that, we will not retain them. We won't retain their loyalty or their commitment or their engagement. And then we will all suffer as a consequence.
Thank you very much. So panel, we now have 5 minutes remaining, so we'll have to be a bit quick fire. But one question that's come in that I think is worth really talking about, because it came up in all three of your pieces, is how can we revalue key work in more tangible ways? Because I think we've all seen, and I mentioned it in my opening remarks too, that our key workers are very visible to us at the moment, and a lot of them we know are poorly paid and not in what you would call good work. So does anyone on the panel want to have a crack at that? Okay, I'm seeing Helen, and Darren looks like he's nodding, so I'll start with Helen and then move to Darren. And we've only got 4 minutes now, 5 minutes.
Yes. Well, I was going to say it's all very well to clap for people, but you do actually have to enable them to live a life that's meaningful to them and pay them fairly. And I do think that one of the issues when we didn't discuss the possibility of universal basic income in the last Commission for Work was because of the sense that society isn't prepared to pay for that through taxes or loans. Well, now society hasn't got a choice. It is massively subsidising work and non-work because we can't allow it to fail. And I do think now might be a moment, at least experimentally, to say where are jobs where we will pay a living wage because these are things we want to be done and they're valuable and we value them and we just have to pay for them. And it could be done short term. That's what's attractive about this moment. Nobody has to take the big, let's introduce UBI and it doesn't work decision. It's a short term transitional thing.
So a living wage for key workers.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Darren?
So I obviously agree with the principle that we should be paying our frontline workers at the very minimum a living wage so that they can have a meaningful work experience and then be able to live comfortably in their communities too. You've then got to move to the question about how do you pay for that? And one of the things that we do know is that we're an aging society. Our economy has not been growing. Productivity has been stagnant. Exports have been declining. This is all pre-pandemic. But the cost of running our public services was going up and up and up. And so we have this huge time bomb shell, essentially, about trying to figure out how we do this. And now is an opportunity to think about that. But this is why all of the threads today link together. Because actually, if you're able to stimulate growth in the economy through the adoption of AI and technology, then of course you've got more tax revenues and incomes coming into the exchequer. But equally, if you're able to modernize and transform the delivery of public services, so it improves efficiency, reduces costs, and then allows people to do the really people-centric work, then in theory, at least you've got more kind of capacity and budget to be able to put that money towards people to improve their wages and their salaries as well, and to value social care workers for the human interaction that they can have, which, you know, AI algorithms are not ever going to be able to have. So we do need to be pragmatic about it as well. So it's principles and how do you do it. But to go back to my original comment, I think you do that through technology adoption in order to create more revenue and increase efficiency too.
And can I ask you, Darren, as the final word, is your new Bayes Committee inquiry expected to have a dedicated future of work strand? Because that would be great.
So we will have a series of dedicated packages of work under the super inquiry of post-pandemic growth. I have every expectation that there will be a chapter of work on skills and the future of work. The only reason I say expectation is because I'm the chair, but I've got to get the committee to agree with me on that, and we've not done that yet. But I do expect it to be coming in the coming months. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I will close it down there. Thank you very much, panel, for your thoughtful and insightful contributions. The word that probably got mentioned most was trust, followed by good work. But that's been a really useful round trip. For people that are interested in any of the surveys or the commission output, then our website is ifow.org, so do visit that. Thank you very much. I will hand back to Nyasha.
Apologies for that. One of the hazards of the future of work, I think, is ensuring that our technology works. But thank you very much to all of our panelists for helping us to think about how we can use the present moment as a way to move towards more equitable, fairer work that ensures that we avoid some of the pitfalls of things that have happened over the last 30 years. And for those who are listening, it would be great if you're able to, after a 15-minute break, head over onto the Q&A so that you can ask all of those who spoke a little bit more about what the Commission is planning for the future. And please do, if you have any particular questions, add those in to the Slido question website. That would be very helpful. And please tweet anything that really stood out to you, anything that you thought was interesting, at both hashtag CogX 2020 and also on the Institute for the Future of Work's Twitter handle, which is @_future of work. Thank you again. And just to remind you that there'll be a short break before the next session starts. And you'll need to have the correct pass for that. But thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your mornings.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.